Hi, welcome to the Week 10 Forum. This week we are investigating the so-called tools of the trade, or the methodology of primarily dissident terrorist groups. Martin looks at the objectives, methods, and targets of terrorist groups, giving you an inside look at why terrorists employ terroristic violence, who terrorists have typically attempted to target, and which tools terrorists employ when they decide to attack. Uh, Martin reminds us of the importance of perspective and understanding why people resort to terrorism. There's a certain amount of repetition in this, but sometimes repetition is valuable. So when we read the material in this chapter, Martin wants us to remember the phrases from chapter 2, right? It became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. Extremism in defense of liberty is not a vice. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. One man willing to throw away his life is enough to terrorize 1,000. Martin makes two really important claims in this chapter. One, that terrorist violence is rarely senseless. Most terrorist events are carefully planned and give evidence of rational, if extreme, motivations. And two, that terrorist violence is rarely random. The 9/11 attackers, for example, clearly viewed the World Trade Center as a symbolic heart of American imperialism, and believed that its destruction would be a severe blow to American prestige. Likewise with the Pentagon. As well as hurting the U.S. economy in a non-trivial sense. Um, I think that Table 10.1 categorizing the targets of terrorist attacks in 2015 is really important. First, take note, in 2015 there were over 12,000 incidents of violence categorized as terrorist attacks. Then note that only over half of those attacks were aimed at the top two categories, private citizens and property and police. That seems significant to me, and I'd like to know if those numbers are tracked over time, if 2015 was a typical year. What are the typical objectives that terrorists hope to achieve when they launch an attack? Martin argues that terrorist groups generally have minimal or optimal objectives, right? That creates a range of expectations that can be evaluated following an attack or a campaign. Typically, dissident terrorist objectives can range from being fairly modest, which simply to cause social or psychological disruption, or more ambitious, involving actual, paving of a revolutionary environment or creating an actual change in an existing political regime. Terrorists often play to specific audiences. Their selection of target is generally intended to convey symbolic messages to terrorist groups' perceived constituency, which again could involve reassuring confirmed supporters of the viability and activity of a terrorist group, or it could include attempts to shake up an apathetic population, get them to, adopt what Marx would describe as a revolutionary class consciousness. Martin also addresses the objectives of new terrorism. Why does Martin think that new terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have a distinctive approach to terrorism? Why would a group like ISIS want to use weapons of mass destruction? What goals would be served, and at what cost, would be served by killing large numbers of people? Globalization has continued to enhance the capacity of terrorist groups to operate. Terrorists have been able to exploit international travel, computers, and satellite phones and social media to better coordinate their activities. Martin notes that terrorism is a tactic that contributes to the appeal of asymmetrical warfare. And he discusses this idea of net war theory as an example, calling it an emerging mode of conflict and crime in which the protagonists use network forms of organization and related doctrines, strategies, and technologies attuned to the information age. These protagonists are likely to consist of dispersed small groups who communicate, coordinate, and conduct their campaigns in an interneted manner without a precise central command. I had not encountered the word interneted before, but Martin argues that the contemporary dissident movements are increasingly establishing their, virtual linkages to the internet through various social media platforms and using other technologies to enhance their organizational capacities. What obligations do internet providers and social media platforms have to governments to help identify terrorist groups? Martin's discussion of the common methods employed by terrorist groups is fairly straightforward, but I found a couple of points particularly interesting. My study of terrorism in the 1980s made me familiar with the idea of a signature method, which is a form of violence that is considered to be unique to particular groups. Kneecapping in particular, in which Martin describes as shooting a victim in the back of the knee joint, which has the effect of blowing the victim's patella off, is one such thing. I knew that kneecapping was commonplace in the conflict in Northern Ireland. I wasn't aware that the Italian Red Brigades also kneecapped people. Over 2,500 people were kneecapped in Northern Ireland. And that was a penalty that was often inflicted not just on rivals, but on drug pushers and petty criminals. That was sort of part of the vigilante aspect of that conflict. Martin contrasts the high, medium, low range of technological sophistication and threat potential. High range threats include biological or radiological agents and nuclear weapons, while medium range weapons, suggest that a terrorist group have access to military grade weaponry. Trying to bring down an airplane would be an example of that sort of thing. Low range, of course, weapons are things like IEDs, improvised explosive devices, which have proven to be so effective against U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Martin notes that historically terrorist groups have been selective about their choice of weapons and fairly reserved about their use. In my opinion, there is an instinctive sense in which terrorist groups realize that if they cross a certain threshold of violence, they risk isolating themselves and justifying extreme repression by the state. Do you agree that such calculations have constrained dissident groups in the past? What about the present, particularly new terrorist groups like ISIS or Boko Haram? Martin's discussion of different types of weaponry is very interesting, but I find his discussion about the use of suicide bombers to be particularly worthy of consideration. We often equate suicide bombers as employed primarily by Muslims, but the Hindu group, the Tamil Tigers, employed suicide bombers in the 1990s and were very successful, killing, assassinating 2 prime ministers of India. The Lebanese Shiite group Hezbollah is considered to be the pioneer in the use of suicide bombings. Why do groups resort to suicide bombings? What lessons can we draw, from the fact that certain cultures seem to accept that kind of sacrifice as a legitimate approach to political violence? The last part of the chapter deals with the kinds of targets terrorist groups select. The symbolic nature of targets is clearly an important element of target selection, and it's not accidental that terrorists frequently select embassies and diplomatic personnel for attacks. That was certainly what motivated the Libyan radicals that attacked the U.S. compound in Benghazi on September 12, 2012. There is one part of the chapter that I sort of disagree with, and that's Martin's discussion of cyber terrorism. I don't think that cyber terrorism is a thing. I think that terrorist groups employ targeted attacks on computer systems and networks. I think that governments do the same thing, particularly the Russian intelligence agencies. I think they attack government computer facilities in Eastern European countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Georgia, and Ukraine. I also think that ISIS and some other groups are using social media in their recruitment of Western Muslim populations. But these are not, in my opinion, examples of cyber terrorism. In short, I think that there are broad categories of malicious activity that takes place on the internet, and I think that there are activities that we can accurately characterize as cyber warfare. But I don't buy about that notion about cyber terrorism. Maybe that's just a tick of mine. To me, that's just a metaphorical bridge too far. But if you disagree with me, let me know. We can sort it out. So, is terrorism effective? That's how Martin closes the chapter. I wish that the answer to that was no. The reality is that from Machiavelli forward, we realize violence can be very effective, and we have to acknowledge that reality. All right, so we got a lot to cover this week, so let's get to work.